Welcome to part 3 of Theory of the Family. Here we're going to be looking at the newer theories, postmodernism and the personal life perspective. Let's not forget though that this is part of an overall kind of thing where we've been looking in the first part at functionalism and new right, more consensus kind of ideas, and then in the second part we've been looking at Marxism and feminism, and then in the third part we've been looking, this is the third part here, we're going to be looking at postmodernism and the personal life perspective. Now, a slightly harder theory maybe to get our head around is postmodernism. And postmodernism kind of is a theory that explains the changes that have happened in our society over the last 30 years. And primarily those changes are a result of changes in technology. So just like we went from feudalism to industrialism through the Industrial Revolution to get the modern way of living, and that Industrial Revolution and all those inventions, technological inventions, brought about a different way of living. We moved from the countryside into towns and cities. We go to supermarkets rather than growing our own fruit and veg in that kind of way. Postmodernists are arguing that the technology, primarily the internet, has massively changed the way we see things, massively changed the way we do things, and therefore is changing the way we see the family. So a really good way of summing up postmodernism is that all truth is relative. Okay, so I suppose if we apply this idea to the family, we're saying that all truth is relative, all types of family are relative. So whereas Marxists don't particularly like the family, feminists think the family carries on those sort of patriarchal kind of values. Functionalists love the nuclear family and think that all other types of family are problematic. The new right, again, love the nuclear family and think that the lone parent families are evil. Here we're saying that, hang on a minute, from a postmodern point of view, all types of family are valid and should be recognised as being valid regardless of what that type of family is. Okay, so all truth is relative to me as an individual. All truth is relative to me as an individual. A really good sort of understanding of this is this Salvador Dali sculpture that we've got in front of us. It's a lobster and it's a phone. Lobster phone. I don't know if any of you own a lobster phone. Probably not, because that's worth hundreds of millions of pounds as a sculpture. So you probably don't own a lobster phone. But Salvador Dali there, in a postmodern way, is trying to mess with our brains in terms of what is real and what is not real. In maybe an easier way for us to understand this idea of hyper-reality, which is very much a postmodern concept, we might want to look at a programme like The Only Way is Essex or Love Island, which would be two classically hyper-real kind of ideas, blending reality with not reality. So it would be a bit scary, maybe you don't think so, I personally think it would, if everybody looked like the men and women on Love Island. I wonder how long it takes them to get the bodies that they have on Love Island. I wonder how much plastic it takes them to be put inside them to get those bodies that they have on Love Island. So it's not everybody that looks like that. And then when they go through the show and everything gets provided for them, that's not everybody's life. That's not reality. They're not living reality while they're on that show. I know it's a game show and I know that they're doing it to win a prize at the end. But the reality is people will watch it and people will think, well, maybe that is real life, or maybe I want my life to be like that. So their television show shapes reality at the same time as not being reality, at the same time as shaping reality. That sort of blending of those kind of things. So if I'm a postmodernist, there is no truth. There's no absolute truth. Like the Bible, absolute truth. Feminism, absolute truth. Marxism, absolute truth. The Quran, absolute truth. And because of the media-saturated world that we live in, then this hyper-reality blends what is real and what isn't real, and what is real and what isn't real, and therefore sometimes it's hard to tell where one thing starts and another thing stops. So in our world today, I wonder how many of us actually live in an alternative style of family, or how many of us actually, in our heart of hearts, when we're thinking about family, or when we're living in family, actually just live in a bog standard nuclear family, or want to live in a bog standard nuclear family. Okay, so it's probably a good idea for us to start with Baudrillard, because Baudrillard is one of the big movers in postmodernism and helps us understand what postmodernism is about. So I've already dealt with hyperreality, so I don't need to go back to that, but it's Baudrillard that talks about hyperreality. We can talk about choice and diversity, that's what postmodernists want, and within the family, that's absolutely what postmodernists want. And they kind of have this idea that there is no meta-narratives. Yeah, they don't like the idea of meta-narratives. A meta-narrative is a big story, and a big story is something like the Bible or the Quran or the Guru Granth Sahib or functionalism or Marxism or feminism. They don't like this one-size-fits-all kind of mentality, because truth is relative to me, the individual. My truth is different to your truth. But again, I kind of wonder whether one criticism might be by them saying there are no meta-narratives. That is actually a meta-narrative itself, so that's a bit of internal criticism. But again, I kind of wonder as well about postmodernism, that it might be nice to be a postmodernist in a lovely safe country like Britain, where you can choose what you want to do, and you can choose what you want to wear, and you can choose how you want to be, and you can choose all of those kind of things, and not many people are going to criticise you too much, and if they do, it's probably going to be in a very passive aggressive online kind of way. You're probably not in fear of your life. Okay. However, if we were in the Sudan starving, or in Ethiopia being a sort of child soldier, I wonder whether that we'd have the same kind of perspective. I wonder whether we'd think that there is no meta-narratives, because the external reality, how other people see the world, absolutely shapes things in those kind of environments. So just a little bit of evaluation there to get you thinking about stuff. So if we start with Judith Stacey, a great postmodern author, she actually argues that as we've moved forward in time into the world that we live in the last 30 years, this sort of choice that women now have has massively helped them to become more individual, and the sort of choice in the diversity of how we can run our families. I think back in my family, and my grandmother had a baby outside of wedlock during World War II. Now what she had to do, because it was such a bad thing to do that in Scotland, is when she became pregnant, she moved. She had the baby in a completely different place where nobody knew her. She went to a big city to have it adopted, and then went back to where she lived, and no one was any the wiser. And nobody knew anything. I didn't know anything about this in our family until my father died about 20 years ago. And when my father died, this man, who was my uncle, arrived at the funeral, who nobody knew anything about. But then it all came out at that kind of point. Now that's kind of extreme. I wonder whether we'd do that today. If any of you became pregnant, would you feel the pressure to run away and not tell anybody, have the baby, put it up for adoption, and do those kind of things? I wonder whether there's as brutal a culture in the world that we live in as there was back in the 1940s when my grandmother got pregnant. So, I mean, that's just an interesting thing. So, as far as Stacey is concerned, this diversity of family life has massively shaped choice for women and massively improved the life of women. And even though the next two authors aren't really postmodernists, then they do add quite a lot to a postmodern idea, which is this individualisation thesis. Okay, so both Beck and Giddens kind of are fighting against postmodernism, but what they are talking about here, in some ways, is this idea of individualisation thesis, and how that individualisation thesis plays out. So somebody like Beck is talking about risk, and talking about the risk that we have in our family lives, and the risks that we have in the world around us. So if we're thinking about risk, it's probably a good idea just to do this little mental exercise. So whenever I'm thinking about risk, I'm thinking about relationships. So let's imagine that you and the class that you're in all live in the same village. You've all grown up together. You've all had life together. You get to 14 or 15, and if you go out with somebody in this class, then it's not going to be that risky because you've grown up in that village together. It's not going to be that risky because you know all the sort of where all the skeletons are buried and where all the skeletons have been hidden. So therefore, it's not a risky decision. Okay, you might make a bad decision, but it's not a risky decision. Whereas today, if we think about risk today, then we think about you've got apps that you can use, that you then look at their picture online. That might be them, that might be them 20 years ago, who knows. And then when you go to meet, they could be an ex-murderer, they could be a rapist, they could be anything. How do you know who they are? You won't have met them, and you're trusting what you read online. So therefore, dating today is far riskier than it was at any other time. So Beck also talks about this negotiated family. That in this postmodern world and this individual world, we can negotiate family life based on who and what we are as an individual. So we're not kind of tied to those old ideas of nuclear or whatever. We can sort of bring things together. So you might live in a family that Beck's talking about here, in terms of get married, get divorced, and then you get married again and have other children. So you might have half brothers and step brothers, and it might look very complicated, but in the end, we definitely have this idea that in today's world we negotiate, as in maybe the parents are the ones that do that kind of negotiation. We've got far more gender equality. We've got far more and greater individualism in the world that we're living in, and this has led to lots of different types of family replacing that sort of patriarchal family. He also goes on to talk about this idea of a zombie family. And in this idea of a zombie family, the relationships that we have are now subject to greater uncertainty and greater risk. And for this reason, Beck describes the family as a zombie category. It appears to be alive, but in reality, it is dead. People want the family to be a haven for security in an insecure world, but for quite a lot of people in their families today, they're kind of, maybe they're there because they're bored, maybe they're there because they're scared about breaking up and moving away and having a more fulfilling life in another situation. So this kind of empty shell marriage or zombie family is something that Beck talks about. In some ways, it's about risk as well. It's riskier. Your perception is that it's riskier to break up and move out than it is to stay with your family. So it's a sort of negation of risk. Beck, that's Beck done. So Giddens talks about this idea of a pure relationship. And he thinks in this individualization thesis that this pure relationship is about you coming to a deep understanding about what you want in a relationship, and then meeting somebody and negotiating with that person and having them understand you and you understanding them, and you both give loads to each other and you both make more than the sum of the parts kind of deal. But then when that relationship starts not to work, and not to give each of you what you are wanting in that relationship, then you can move away. And it's not a criticism of the other person, it's just a time of life kind of situation. So a pure relationship is one that is self-aware, and that you understand in that self-aware kind of way. And then when things aren't working, it's just it's not a sort of horrible, nasty breakup with knives and axes and stuff like that. It's a lovely kind of thank you very much for the experience, and we're now moving on. Okay, so he has lots to say about choice as well, and looking at how, say, these same-sex partnerships that have been happening since 2014 in terms of a marriage being allowed, and these same-sex couples that were before were kind of acting as these sort of champions of pioneers, I suppose, as your textbook says, of this world that we now live in 2020, where does anybody really give a stuff about what your sexuality is? I know there are going to be weirdos on the extremities of society that do give a stuff, but does your average person walking down the street, do they care about those kind of things? So interesting to have this more postmodern conversation about the family. The most recent of ideas on the family is this personal life perspective, and it's one that talks about diversity. So in short, I suppose what the personal life perspective is saying, that anything can be part of your family. So the personal life perspective is a kind of postmodern action theory kind of idea, blending of these two ideas together, as well as a little bit of Anthony Giddens in there about understanding the structure of our society and how that structure can impact us and limit us in terms of our choices. And on one level, the personal life perspective is pretty much saying that anything can be part of your family. Your dog, your house, your car, anything, if it's making decisions with you in terms of your family. So if you kind of go, okay, we can't move to that house because it's far too near a road and therefore I'm scared my cat might get run over, then your cat is an integral part of your family, and therefore, we shouldn't be too hung up on this sort of nuclear, lone parent, reconstituted kind of idea. Okay, so to give you a bit of background on Carol Smart. Carol Smart's very much an individual who started her thesis working with the homosexual or LGBTQI kind of community, and was really interested in how people choose their families, and came up with this idea of a connectedness thesis. Because quite often in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, if you came out as being gay, then sometimes your family might completely disown you. And therefore you're in a position where you don't have a family. But what she found happening within the LGBTQ community was that you tended to find people would move towards a sort of centre of that kind of community, maybe Brighton, Dundee, Manchester, in this country. And you would gravitate towards a group of friends, and you would kind of create your own family in that kind of situation. You would kind of go and have a sort of surrogate mother, surrogate father, people you talk to and help you through this journey that we have called life. So Carol Smart is kind of talking that we have a freedom to choose our own families within that kind of structure. She completely rejects this idea of the individualisation thesis that we've gone on about, that this move towards being more individualistic gives us more diversity, because she kind of thinks that people still want family. Whether they get kicked out of one or not, they still want to live life with a group of people and move through life with a group of people. So it's a really interesting theory and a really interesting set of ideas about that whole world. But again, it does derive initially from the LGBTQ community, where people have experienced massive oppression and massive horribleness from family members and from society, and have come together and created their own family networks within that kind of world. So to give you an idea, some of the families she was working with in coming up with this theory and in researching, doing her research. So the one family that I'm thinking about here is you've got a lesbian couple. Okay, a lesbian couple want to have a child. Going to struggle to have a child unless they have a sperm donor. So they find a sperm donor, one of their friends who's gay, who comes along and donates the sperm. And interesting, have a baby, okay, but his mum and dad, his mum develops cancer. So he's gay. He's probably not going to give her any children, any grandchildren to think about, but knows that this situation has happened. So the grandmother, who is related biologically to the baby, but isn't related in any kind of legal sense to the baby, asks to be part of that baby's life in the last years of her life. Okay, so we've got mum and mum who have the baby. There's no legal tie to dad, but there is a biological tie to dad. And then you've got grandmum who wants to be involved in that relationship. So that's not a normal family kind of structure. And then, sadly, grandmother dies of cancer. And then the grandfather in that situation asks to carry on being part of that child's life because he's become quite attached to that situation during the couple of years that they had together. Yeah, all the way through this, the biological father has no interest in being part of that relationship at all. So it kind of skips that kind of generation. So that's a kind of connectedness thesis that Carol Smart is looking at, that freedom to choose, that Carol Smart is looking at, is these families that are growing up that don't fit this normal, in inverted commas, nuclear way of looking at the world. So in summary, functionalists take a consensus view of the family. They see it as a universal institution that happens everywhere and performs essential jobs for society. Things like a functional fit between the nuclear family and modern society, and having this lovely mobile workforce that can go anywhere, and it's just the nuclear family is best if I'm a functionalist. However, Marxists have a more conflict view of society, and they see that the family fits the economic and ideological needs of capitalism. They don't like that at all. They want to get rid of the family because it's getting in the way of how society should work as far as they're concerned. They want to have that revolution, and the family is stopping that. Feminists, again, part of a conflict perspective, have this kind of idea of patriarchy. There are a number of different types of feminism. You can go back and listen to that again. But pretty much all four of the types of feminists, three waves of feminism, are saying that patriarchy is getting in the way and we need to address that patriarchy. So they don't particularly like the family because the family is often organised in that patriarchal kind of way. Yeah, functionalist Marxist and feminist theories have all been criticised for neglecting family diversity and this idea of choice. And that's where we can start talking about postmodernism and individualisation thesis, and we can talk about the personal life perspective and the sort of connectedness thesis. Both of those ideas are talking about diversity and about choice, but talking about those things in very different ways. The personal life perspective argues that we must focus on the meanings people give to relationships and how they define what counts as family in terms of that connectedness thesis.